High in the Andes, the world reduces itself to three repeating elements: snow, rock, and sky. At roughly 12,000 feet, air thins enough that every movement feels measured. Wind has nothing to stop it. Light becomes sharper, reflecting off ice and pale stone, and the cold arrives fast the moment the sun slips behind a ridge. October in the Andes can still behave like winter. Snow that looks smooth from a distance becomes broken and deceptive up close: hard crust, hidden cracks, steep drops. There are no roads here, no trees, and almost nothing that feels made for people. The mountains don't look empty, but they feel indifferent. Like a barrier made physical. The people who would later be known as the survivors of Flight 571 didn't board a plane expecting any of this. They were mostly Uruguayan, many linked to the Old Christians rugby club from Montevideo, traveling with friends and family. Alongside them were other passengers and the crew, operating a Uruguayan Air Force aircraft used for a civilian charter. Their destination was Santiago, Chile. A match was planned. Social commitments, a short trip, something routine. They weren't carrying expedition gear, no survival equipment, no cold weather supplies. Just normal luggage for a city stay and the ordinary confidence that a flight ends at an airport. The aircraft was a Fairchild FH-227D, a turboprop built for regional routes. In 1972, this kind of flight relied on radio navigation, timed headings, and calculations, no satellite positioning, no modern GPS. Over the Andes, that mattered. If weather closed in and visibility failed, the margin for error shrank quickly. The flight did not cross in one clean run. After leaving Uruguay, it stopped in Mendoza, Argentina, common staging at the edge of the mountains, waiting for conditions to improve. From Mendoza, the Andes look like a distant wall, tall, bright, contained. It doesn't feel like exposure yet. When they resumed, cloud and turbulence limited what could be seen. Inside the cabin, the experience still felt normal: engine vibration, steady hum, small routines of travel. Even glimpses of mountains through cloud breaks looked like scenery, not warning. At some point, the crew believed they had cleared the most dangerous portion and requested descent toward Santiago. That assumption was wrong. Weather obscured visual cues, navigation depended on estimates, and position was misjudged. The aircraft began descending while still inside mountainous terrain. For passengers, a descent feels ordinary. The engine pitch shifts. Ears pressurize. It usually means landing. But here, terrain could rise faster than the aircraft could drop. The Andes aren't one clean ridge and then open country. They are layered. Valleys can look wide enough until the next wall appears out of cloud. In the final minutes, the crew tried to correct power changes, urgent adjustments, but space and time were almost gone. Impact didn't arrive as one clean collision. The aircraft struck terrain, broke apart, and sections separated. The fuselage was torn open and pushed down along snow and rock. Forces acted instantly: structural failure, violent deceleration, luggage becoming projectiles, bodies thrown against restraints and each other. When it stopped, what remained wasn't a plane in any functional sense. It was a damaged shell in a high, cold basin, snow everywhere, peaks surrounding it, and no clear route out. Whatever expectations existed that morning, arrival, match, city streets, ended in seconds. A new reality began, measured in meters of snow and the slow arithmetic of temperature and time. In the immediate aftermath, survival wasn't strategy. It was accounting. Who was alive? Who could move? Who could speak? The fuselage section that remained intact formed a narrow cavity, open at one end, torn along the sides, seats still bolted to the floor. The tail section had separated. Wings were gone. Around them, nothing but cold and height. Those who were conscious began pulling others out, slow work made harder by injury and thin air. Some passengers were already dead. Others died soon after from trauma. There was no real medical care, only a small onboard kit. They used what they had, torn fabric as bandages, seat cushions as splints, pressure to stop bleeding. They moved injured people into the most protected section of the fuselage and tried to reduce exposure to wind cutting through openings. Cold asserted itself quickly. Snow was both surface and threat, bright in daylight, deadly at night. If they lay directly on it, heat drained fast. They layered whatever insulation they could find, seat padding, clothing, luggage contents. The aircraft interior became a crude shelter. The goal wasn't comfort. It was reducing heat loss by any fraction. Food and water became immediate questions. They gathered what remained: chocolate, snacks, small provisions, wine. It wasn't meant for long survival. Water existed everywhere, locked in snow and ice. But melting it required heat they didn't have. Eating snow directly risked lowering core temperature and triggering hypothermia. They tried softening snow in containers under sunlight, carefully, slowly, always balancing thirst against cold. The radio became a thin thread to the outside world. They could hear fragments of broadcasts and search news, even if sending outward was difficult. Still, hearing voices mattered. It proved the world still existed beyond the peaks. Night made everything worse. Temperature dropped sharply. Inside the fuselage, survivors pressed together for warmth. Injuries made sleep painful. The Andes didn't change. The boundary wasn't marked by fences or signs, it was marked by the fact that beyond the wreck, in every direction, there was only snow, rock, and height. After the first shock, survival became procedural. They rationed early, pieces of chocolate divided into portions so small they barely counted. The aim wasn't to feel fed, only to slow decline. They reorganized the fuselage interior, moved debris, patched openings with luggage and fabric to reduce drafts. Not sealed, impossible, but less exposed. Cold management became a discipline. They learned which sections warmed in sunlight and which stayed shaded. In sun, movement felt easier and snow softened. At night, they clustered tightly because separation meant losing heat faster. Close quarters brought discomfort, illness risk, tension, but the alternative was worse. Days were counted. Time was tracked because structure mattered. And then, through radio reports, they learned something that changed everything: the search had been reduced, and then stopped. That meant waiting wasn't a plan. It was a gamble with shrinking odds. Soon, the food was gone. The environment offered no substitute, no animals, no vegetation, nothing to hunt or gather. Attempts to move outward were limited by injuries, deep snow, weak bodies, and inadequate clothing. Hunger became constant. It affects judgment, coordination, sleep. It turns every thought toward calories. And then the choice became unavoidable. The only available source of calories and protein was the bodies of those who had died. Later, survivors described the decision as structured and deliberate, not impulsive. Discussed as a last measure. Many were raised Catholic and framed it in moral and religious terms: necessity in a place without alternatives. The dead were their friends and family. That made it heavier. But starvation made it inevitable. Once they crossed that line, they managed it with restraint. Portions were small. Distribution was controlled. The purpose wasn't cruelty or spectacle, only survival, to keep enough strength to endure cold, care for the injured, and eventually attempt movement beyond the wreck. Weeks passed. The crash site became less like a temporary stop and more like a fragile settlement. Bodies adapted in limited ways and failed in others. Weight dropped. Wounds lingered. Simple tasks took longer. Sunlight allowed brief work, shade forced retreat. The radio carried the outside world like distant noise. Then another disaster arrived. In the night, an avalanche came down onto the wreck. Snow poured into the open fuselage, crushing space, choking air, trapping people in darkness. Some who survived the crash did not survive this. The group's numbers fell again. Afterward, they dug out snow by hand with improvised tools, a slow process made harder by thin air and weakened bodies. The interior became more confined. And mentally, the avalanche changed everything, even shelter could be swallowed. Waiting now carried another risk. Time blurred. The same motions repeated, melting snow, dividing portions, caring for the injured, patching drafts, clearing snow. Grief didn't resolve, it sat beside practical work. And the question returned again and again, stay and die slowly, or leave and possibly die quickly. Early attempts to explore outward showed how brutal the terrain was. Deep snow, steep ridges, distances that looked short but took hours. Without proper boots, frostbite became a real threat. Without maps, bearings were uncertain. And losing the wreck meant losing the only shelter. But by early December, 2 months after the crash, the survivors understood the math. Remaining meant a predictable end. So preparations for a trek began: gather the warmest clothing, layer fabric, build a sleeping setup from aircraft insulation, plan around the small nutrition they could carry. Eventually, the effort centered on 2 men willing and able to take the risk, Fernando Paradu and Roberto Canessa. They left the fuselage behind as the last fixed point. The first climb revealed a hard truth: what they thought might be an exit was a higher wall. They were deeper in the mountains than they assumed. The landscape didn't open. It rose. Still, they continued. The trek became a sequence of measurable problems: keep body heat while moving and stopping, ration food, manage fatigue, choose routes without reliable navigation. Snow changed with sunlight and elevation, sometimes hard enough to support them, sometimes collapsing underfoot. Nights were the worst. Outside shelter, cold became a constant threat. Their improvised sleeping setup was the difference between waking up and not waking up. After days, terrain began to change. Snow gave way to rock in places. Then lower ground. Then small signs that life existed beyond white silence, less continuous ice, varied surfaces, and eventually vegetation. The first human contact wasn't a rescue team. It was ordinary life in the mountains. They encountered a Chilean muleteer, Sergio Catalan, across a river they couldn't easily cross. The distance and noise made communication difficult. But the message got through: there were survivors, and help was needed. Catalan carried the alert to authorities, and organized rescue began. Helicopters reached the crash site in stages, limited by altitude, weather, and capacity. The remaining survivors were flown out. Rescue didn't erase what happened. It ended isolation. It brought them back into the world. When they returned to settled ground, survival didn't end cleanly. They were malnourished, injured, changed by cold and altitude. Medical care and rehabilitation followed. And then came public attention, fast and intense, first for the unbelievable survival, then for the detail outsiders struggled to accept: the use of the dead as food. The survivors addressed it directly. Not as triumph. Not as spectacle. As necessity, limits, absence of alternatives, and the cost of staying alive in a place that offered almost nothing. Historically, the incident sits at the intersection of aviation limitation and human endurance. The crash wasn't a single mysterious cause, but a chain of vulnerabilities: weather, navigation constraints of the time, and the unforgiving geometry of mountains. Survival wasn't a single heroic act either. It was daily repetition under pressure, shelter management, rationing, discipline, care, and finally the decision to walk when waiting no longer served life. The wreck stayed where it was, gradually absorbed into snow and rock. The survivors didn't. But the numbers remain fixed in history: 72 days, roughly 12,000 feet, in a world made of snow, rock, and sky, where routine became survival, and survival became a boundary no one expected to cross.